these days of bland, multi-billion-dollar conglomerates that we're all familiar with today, we all tend to forget that there was a time when conglomerates were kind of a hot topic, especially within the entertainment business. You had a parking services company getting into comics and movies, beverage companies getting into the film business, Panasonic competing with Sony for box office supremacy. There was even a brief period in time when a hotel franchisor had a massive PC gaming empire before it all came crashing down. But that's a story for another time. But by far one of the earliest conglomerates that had a hand in pretty much anything you could think of came before modern-day Disney, Amazon, Tencent, heck, even Berkshire Hathaway. With Sonic the Hedgehog 3 out in the wild, I think it makes perfect sense to reflect on a time when Paramount and Sega were once both corporate siblings. Yes, really. This is the story of Gulf+Western. The story of Gulf+Western begins with its founder, Charles Bluhdorn. Bluhdorn was born on September 20th, 1926 in Vienna, Austria, as Karl Bluhdorn. At a young age, he was a rather rowdy fellow. At the age of 16, Bluhdorn immigrated to the United States, where he studied at the City College of New York and Columbia University during World War II. After briefly serving in the U.S. Air Force, he got a job as a clerk for a cotton exchange, where he earned only $15 a week. Keep in mind, this was 1946. $15 in that time period is worth around $243 today. His experience in commodities taught Bluhdorn a thing or two about the intricacies of international trade, and after his brief stint at the cotton exchange, he decided to invest $3,000 into his own import-export business at the age of 23. By the early to mid-50s, he found success importing coffee from Brazil and Africa through his company Fortuna Coffee. However, there was a downside. The coffee business was prone to fluctuation. One day you're making a killing, the next day you're making next to nothing. So Bluhdorn, now a millionaire, began searching for another industry that offered greater security. The auto industry seemed to offer just that. In the 1950s, automobiles were booming. With every passing year, cars were becoming more and more popular, giving people the freedom to travel on the road than to travel by rail. At the time, some American families went from one car to 2 or 3 cars. This not only generated a market with over 100 million vehicles on the road, but it also provided more jobs. However, like any industry, it wasn't entirely immune to economic slumps. For example, if car production were to decrease due to low demand, drivers intended to run their cars longer. To keep their vehicles running, drivers would rely on replacement auto parts to fix any problems. However, if car sales were to increase, auto parts sales to new cars would also increase. Thus, there would be more cars on the road that would eventually need replacement parts. Essentially, the auto parts business was nominally affected by economic downturns, perfect for Bluhdorn to jump in. However, he also wanted a publicly traded company, whose stock could be used to purchase other companies in that industry. Enter the Michigan Plating and Stamping Company, originally founded as the Michigan Bumper Corporation, to acquire the assets of the bankrupt Wolverine Bumper and Specialty Company on November 8, 1934, before changing its name in 1955. The company, based in Grand Rapids, had sales worth around $8.4 million, and had a contract to supply rear bumpers to Studebakers, when those were a thing. It was also publicly traded on the American Stock Exchange, exactly what Bluhdorn was looking for. So, in 1956, Charles Bluhdorn acquired Michigan Plating and Stamping, and on December 30th of the following year, the company purchased Beard & Stone Electric Company, an auto parts distributor out of Houston, Texas. By 1958, Bluhdorn had taken over as chairman and CEO, and on November 5th, the company was renamed to the Gulf+Western Corporation. The name comes from its operations on the Gulf Coast, as well as the company's intent on expanding into the ever-growing auto industry in the western United States. John Duncan became the company's first president, while David Judelson, a mechanical engineer, served as a company director. From there, the company, later renamed to Gulf+Western Industries Incorporated, went on a buying spree. In total, they acquired 58 companies over the next several years, namely in manufacturing and auto parts. Many of those acquired would later become part of the American Parts System, the company's auto parts distribution division. By the start of 1966, Gulf+Western had become one of the largest wholesale distributors of auto parts in the country, with an annual revenue of almost $200 million, an estimated $2 billion today. but Bluhdorn had much bigger and wilder ambitions. With the company doing pretty well for themselves, he and his team started implementing a broader philosophy of growth through diversification. In a diversified conglomerate, if one business were to falter, they could rely on another successful business that could potentially offset the losses of the other. It also gave them an opportunity to look for assets that had future potential for growth with proved management, or if undermanaged, could potentially turn it around. In his book, The Gulf+Western Story, Bluhdorn explains that, quote, by basing the company on a variety of products and markets, the company could more successfully withstand the strains and capitalize on the opportunities of a constantly changing economy. So, on February 25, 1966, thanks to an agreement with Chase Manhattan Bank, Gulf+Western completed its $171 million acquisition of New Jersey Zinc, a zinc mining and chemical company which had large cash reserves that management didn't know what to do with. Bluhdorn would use this acquisition as a way to buy more companies, particularly those with undervalued assets, and his next target would be one that had a mountain of entertainment. Now, Paramount needs no introduction. They're one of the oldest surviving major film studios in the world, the second oldest film studio in the United States behind Universal, and the only one still headquartered in Hollywood. The historic studio's history, however, is a little complicated. Paramount's origins trace back to three individuals. The first was Hungarian-born Adolf Zukor, who formed the Famous Players Film Company on June 1, 1912. Their first film released was Les Amours de la Reine Elisabeth. Sorry if I butcher my French, which premiered in the United States on July 12th as simply Queen Elizabeth. However, they merely distributed the film and didn't start producing their own moving pictures until 1913. Meanwhile, another key figure, American-born Jesse Louis Lasky, was also looking to venture into motion pictures after producing stage musicals for Broadway. Using some borrowed money from his brother-in-law Samuel Goldfish, better known as Samuel Goldwyn, he founded the Jesse L. Lasky Feature Play Company on November 26, 1913. Their first film was The Squaw Man, released on February 12, 1914, and was notable for being one of the very first movies to be shot in Hollywood. It was directed by then inexperienced filmmaker Cecil B. DeMille, a man who would go on to direct legendary films like The Ten Commandments. Either version works. Then we come to William Wadsworth Hodkinson, a theater owner out of Utah who merged several smaller firms he acquired to create a new exhibition startup called Progressive Pictures. However, when he tried to incorporate the company on the East Coast, he discovered that the name was already taken. So he decided on Paramount Pictures, incorporated in New York on May 8, 1914, as Paramount Pictures Corporation. Hodkinson's Paramount pioneered what was considered a new concept of film distribution. Rather than have producers sell movies on a statewide or regional basis, which were rather ineffective and costly, they would instead release films through a nationwide distributor, with both the producer and distributor getting a cut of the profit, a method that is still widely used today, even outside of movies. Zukor's Famous Players, Lasky Feature Play, and Hobart Bosworth would become the first producers to release their films through Paramount. However, Zukor and Lasky weren't thrilled with the fact that they were sharing the profits with Hodkinson and wanted all the money for themselves. That's business for ya. So, after devising a plan to oust Hodkinson, all three companies came together to form the Famous Players Lasky Corporation, incorporated on July 19, 1916. Zukor was president, Lasky was vice president and head of production, and Hodkinson was, bought out. Initially, Famous Players Lasky was a holding company that would acquire several production studios over a one-year period. But by December 29, 1917, every subsidiary under their umbrella were consolidated as one, with Paramount serving as their primary distribution label. Throughout the 1920s, Paramount was largely successful, mainly thanks to two then common business practices. Much like the rest of the Big Five studios during the golden age of Hollywood, Paramount not only owned movie theaters, but they also engaged in block booking, where smaller and independent theaters would have to buy a year's worth of films in order to get one of their top films for exhibition. This also included films that had not yet entered production. Although these two practices guaranteed profit and low risk, they were also rather controversial and eventually scrutinized, which I'll get to later. In 1927, Famous Lasky adopted Paramount into its name, before ditching the Famous and Lasky names 3 years later in favor of Publix, a theater chain formed from Paramount's acquisition of the Balaban and Katz chain in 1926. However, much like any business of that period, the Great Depression hit them hard, and Paramount was no exception. In 1932, Lasky was tossed out, and the studio sold their share in a then-young radio network, CBS, which they acquired a stake in 3 years prior. By the following year, Paramount had declared bankruptcy, only hanging on by a thread. The studio would eventually emerge from bankruptcy in 1935, now operating under the name Paramount Pictures Incorporated, with Adolf Zukor becoming chairman. From there, Paramount's success would resume, putting an emphasis on stars, both live action and animation. However, their second dark age was upon them. Following the end of World War II, the US government brought the studios to court over their vertical monopoly and anti-competitive practices. The case, United States v. Paramount Pictures Incorporated, officially went to trial on October 8, 1945, and was initially decided in favor of the studios. Not willing to give up, the US government appealed to the Supreme Court, where on May 3, 1948, they reached their decision against the studios. From this came the Paramount decrees. Studios were not only barred from owning movie theaters in the United States, but block booking was now deemed illegal, effectively ending the golden era of Hollywood. These decrees have since been formally repealed as of 2022. All of the major studios had to split themselves from their theater chains, and Paramount was no exception. In 1949, the studio spun off their exhibition holdings as United Paramount Theaters, who would later merge with the struggling ABC network, turn it around to a success, and eventually rebranded themselves under the ABC name. Meanwhile, the studio, now going by Paramount Pictures Corporation, continued to produce and distribute films, albeit with no guaranteed profit anymore. To make things worse, they were also going up against a disruptive medium known as television. To counter this, studios turned to spectacle, with Paramount using VistaVision, a widescreen format that competed with CinemaScope, where instead of filming vertically through a squished frame, it was filmed sideways for better clarity, an idea that would eventually make its way to IMAX in the 70s. However, Paramount did attempt to get into television as early as 1939, one of the first studios to do so. They had a minority stake in Dumont, owned 2 TV stations in Los Angeles and Chicago, and even launched their own TV network that lasted from 1948 to 1956. Paramount also invested in an experimental pay TV service called Telemeter, which was coin-operated and didn't go anywhere. In fact, none of their TV ventures were particularly successful, primarily due to federal regulations at the time preventing them from gaining more power in this medium. So by the mid-50s, the studio pulled back, instead opting to sell their so-called worthless libraries for television, and would later sell its Los Angeles TV station off. Despite the cash injection, Paramount struggled throughout the 60s, with heavy losses from its film productions, combined with outright refusing to license their films to television, while every other studio was embracing it. Adolf Zukor would step down as chairman in 1964, assuming chairman emeritus, a title he kept until his death in 1976, at the age of 103. By 1966, Paramount Pictures was on the verge of another bankruptcy. However, the company did have undervalued assets, particularly real estate, and a library of films that could have value if sold to television. This is where Bluhdorn comes in. On March 24, 1966, Charles Bluhdorn joined the board of directors at Paramount Pictures, with the intent of acquiring the company, which he felt was the equivalent of, quote, buying a bank. The acquisition was later made official on June 30th, with Gulf+Western having to fork out $130 million, or $1.26 billion today. The deal was finalized on October 19th, with Paramount forming the nucleus of Gulf+Western's newly established Leisure Time Group. But even with huge financial backing, changes had to be made. Bluhdorn appointed himself as president, CEO, and chairman of Paramount, while Martin Davis of the studio was promoted to executive vice president. They then brought in a then-unknown producer, Robert Evans, as head of production, and the studio finally began licensing its catalog to television. Better late than never, I guess. With these changes, things began to turn around for Paramount at the box office, going from near bottom of the barrel to top of the world, releasing major hits such as The Odd Couple, True Grit, Love Story, The Godfather, and Chinatown, just to name a few. Gulf and Western would further boost Paramount's TV presence through the acquisition of Lucille Ball's production company Desilu on July 25, 1967, for around $17 million. For the many who've probably never heard of them, they're responsible for the few classics like Star Trek, Mission Impossible, and of course, The Lucy Show. Following the acquisition, Desilu became Paramount's television production arm, which later produced hits like The Brady Bunch and Happy Days. Aside from film and television, however, Gulf and Western also entered the music business. When the company acquired Paramount, they also absorbed Famous Music and Dot Records, the latter of which Paramount acquired in 1957. Gulf and Western later added Stax Records to its portfolio in 1968, which they sold off 2 years later. In the early 70s, the company formed a new record label group under Famous Music, consisting of the aforementioned Dot Records, Paramount Records, Tumbleweed Records, Blue Thumb Records, and provided distribution for labels like Neighborhood Records and Sire Records. However, this group didn't last long, as they were all sold to ABC in 1974, who subsequently sold their entire record division to MCA 5 years later. Going back to 1967, Gulf and Western moved their headquarters from Houston to New York City, while the company continued to diversify and expand its portfolio, buying up 32 more companies and adding more operating groups over the next few years. These included Taylor Forge, South Puerto Rico Sugar Company, E.W. Bliss Company, Consolidated Cigar Corporation, Universal American Corporation, Brown Company, and Associates Investment Company, just to name a few. They also attempted to acquire control of Sinclair Oil, and even bought shares in Pan Am. However, their interests were short-lived. During their acquisition spree, Gulf and Western's stock price soared, and by 1968, the company's annual sales had surpassed $1 billion, over $9 billion today. In August of 1967, David Judelson was promoted to the role of president, replacing John Duncan. Now, before we continue on, we have to ask one question. How did Gulf and Western operate all of these subsidiaries? Well, it all boils down to one word: decentralization. Generally speaking, decentralization is where power and functions are dispersed into several authorities or entities, rather than a single, i.e. centralized one. Now, for context, we're not referring to it from a political or open source perspective. In a business sense, when a conglomerate is decentralized, their operations are split between multiple managers, and the decisions are made through them, rather than at the top. This approach offers some benefits, such as faster decision-making, quick to adapting, and more room for creative freedom. Some of the biggest companies in the world, like Google and Disney, use a decentralized business structure, while a company like Apple takes a centralized approach, where the decisions are made at the top. However, in the cases of Google and Disney, they had more of a centralized focus, technology and entertainment respectively. In the case of Gulf and Western, they function more like a diverse holding company. Its operations are split into multiple groups, and each subsidiary under their umbrella were treated like partners. When it came to acquisition, responsibility was shared by Gulf and Western's top management, and the program was run on a very informal basis. There were no corporate guidelines or manual to be applied when considering proposed acquisitions, except for a statement of policy that were circulated among executive personnel. In most instances, the management of acquired companies under Gulf and Western remain unchanged and are given considerable autonomy. The only roles taken over by the parent are the legal and financial services, which are carried out more efficiently by specialists that are part of headquarters, allowing for the subsidiaries to focus on what they do best: create. In Bluhdorn's book, The Gulf and Western Story, he recalled the reason of how they managed it. "We did it with people. Make no mistake about that. You can buy all the assets you want, but if you don't have the people, you have absolutely nothing." Bluhdorn later recalled in the book that he was often told to liquidate companies that weren't initially performing well to get a better multiple. Of course, he wasn't against selling them off if it wasn't doing gangbusters in the long run, or if it didn't fit them well enough. But usually, shutting them down, at least under his watch, was not an option. A modern comparison to this would be Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway, which owns a multitude of companies, including Business Wire, Benjamin Moore, BNSF, Duracell, Fruit of the Loom, Geico, Pilot Flying J, Pampered Chef, Extra Lease, and Dairy Queen, just to name a few. Much like Gulf and Western, they too take a diverse and decentralized approach, with each subsidiary being independently managed like nothing had ever happened. By the start of 1969, Gulf+Western owned over 90 companies across 8 operating groups. Manufacturing represented 38% in overall revenue, with leisure time following in second place, representing around 13% of overall revenue in 1968 alone. However, this growth did come at a cost. Gulf+Western's long-term debt went from $1.8 million in 1960 to less than $1 billion in 1969, primarily due to their big-priced acquisitions, such as Associates Investment. The company also had to slow its acquisition spree to a crawl after their stock price had plummeted that same year, namely due to accusations of inflated earnings on Wall Street. Despite that, the conglomerate overall did see a major increase in sales, and with it, increased profits. But there was one other company that got Gulf+Western into the lucrative gaming business. One that you might recognize. Sega! Okay, so we need to back up a bit yet again. Sega's origins trace back to a company called Service Games, a manufacturer out of Hawaii founded by Irving Bromberg, his son Martin Bromley, and James Humpert. The company initially made coin-operated amusement machines for the US military. However, following the passing of the Johnson Act of 1951, which banned the transport of slot machines in America, Service Games decided to expand its operations to Japan. By 1954, the company began adopting the name Sega, an abbreviation for Service Games. But I'm pretty sure you already knew that. By 1960, however, Service Games had shuttered its Japanese operations, with its assets split between 2 companies. The distribution business became Nihon Guraku Busan, doing business as Utamatic, while the manufacturing business became Nihon Kikai Seizo, doing business as Sega. The split wouldn't last long, however, as both companies re-merged in 1964, operating under one Sega. The following year would see the company merge with Rosen Enterprises, an importer of coin-op games named after its American founder, David Rosen, who at the time resided in Japan. The combined company, Sega Enterprises, quickly left the slot machine business behind to focus on the coin-op gaming market, and released its first arcade game, Periscope, in 1966. Periscope became a surprise hit, and with that, Sega began developing more arcade games, which were exported to countries like the United States, where it cost only 25 cents per play, a first for the time. With this success, Rosen wanted to advance the company further. He initially planned to take Sega public. However, given the hurdles involved, he was later advised to get acquired by a larger firm, which seemed like the more logical choice. So, in 1969, Sega approached Gulf+Western regarding a possible acquisition, and soon, a deal was reached. Gulf+Western now had Sega, with David Rosen at the helm. By 1970, Gulf+Western, which now had 11 operating groups, moved their company headquarters permanently to the newly constructed Gulf+Western building in New York. By 1974, annual sales had exceeded $2 billion, with most of its revenue coming from its financial services, industrial products, and leisure time groups. The company continued its aggressive growth throughout the 70s, diversifying into even more businesses, such as confections through Schrafft's Candy Company, book publishing through Simon & Schuster, clothing and swimwear through Kaiser Roth, which also operated the annual Miss Universe beauty pageant at the time, and even mattresses through Simmons Bedding. In December of 1976, Gulf+Western's Paramount Pictures acquired the Hughes television network from the estate of the late business magnate Howard Hughes, with plans to use its assets for a second attempt at their own television network to rival the Big Three. This proposed fourth network, dubbed the Paramount Television Service, was the brainchild of Barry Diller, a former executive at ABC that had then been recently appointed as CEO and head of production at Paramount. Under his watch, the studio produced even more hits like Saturday Night Fever, Grease, the first Star Trek movie, Airplane, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Terms of Endearment, and Beverly Hills Cop, as well as TV hits like the Happy Days spin-off Laverne and Shirley, Taxi, Cheers, and of course, Police Squad. The Paramount Television Service was initially planned to debut in the spring of 1978. However, Bluhdorn eventually got cold feet. His company pulled the plug several months before the network could launch, as they were concerned that it would become a huge money pit for them. Diller would eventually leave Paramount in 1984 for 20th Century Fox, where he did succeed in pitching a fourth network, eventually leading to the launch of the Fox network in 1986. After Paramount's failed attempt, the studio would later move Hughes to another Gulf+Western subsidiary, Madison Square Garden, which they acquired in 1977 from Penn Central. Yes, that Penn Central, which is a whole other story entirely. Madison Square Garden consisted of its namesake venue, some real estate, the New York Rangers hockey team, the New York Knicks basketball team, and their TV networks. Among them was the Madison Square Garden Sports Network, a nationwide cable channel that would evolve into what is now known as USA Network. Meanwhile, over at Sega, the company was profiting heavily from the arcade boom of the late 70s. During that period in 1978, Sega acquired Gremlin Industries, a manufacturer of microprocessor-based coin-op arcade games. The company, operating under Gremlin Sega or Sega Gremlin, later Sega Electronics, released games such as Head-On, Monaco GP, Turbo, Zaxxon, and Star Trek, the latter of which utilized IP from Gulf and Western's Paramount Pictures. Sega also licensed games from other companies, including Namco's GB, Nintendo's Space Firebird, and Konami's hugely successful Frogger. In 1979, Sega acquired the distribution firm Esco Trading, bringing its founder, Hayao Nakayama, into the company. By the early 1980s, Gulf and Western was in pretty much every business you could think of. They had over 100 companies in its portfolio, annual sales of over $5 billion, and held minority stakes in companies like Cummins, General Tire, BF Goodrich, and the United States Rubber Company, aka Uniroyal. Gulf and Western even had an initiative to develop an electric car, powered by a zinc chloride battery. Eat your hearts out, GM and Tesla. However, the initiative eventually faltered, and this was where the conglomerate's growth stopped. So that leaves us with the next question. What happened to Gulf and Western? How did this conglomerate die in less than a decade? It's easy to put the blame on bloat, but like I said before, Berkshire Hathaway owns a multitude of companies, and are still around today. In 1981, following new environmental regulations, Gulf and Western sold off New Jersey Zinc for $50 million in a management buyout. That same year, the company sold off the unprofitable Schrafft's Candy, which would eventually go out of business. By the start of 1982, Gulf and Western had moved Sega under Paramount Pictures, as part of an effort to get the studio into the lucrative video game market. For a very brief period, Paramount's logo could be seen next to Sega's on the packaging of home ports of Sega arcade games. Barry Diller even went as far as wanting to turn Sega into Paramount's premier video game maker. Despite these changes, Gulf and Western's portfolio was still pretty massive. However, their demise truly began after tragedy struck. On February 19, 1983, Charles Bluhdorn was traveling back to New York from the Dominican Republic on his private jet. During the journey, he suffered a heart attack and was later pronounced dead at 56. The board bypassed the company's president, David Judelson, instead naming senior vice president Martin Davis as their new CEO. Judelson would resign from the company shortly after. Coming from his role at Paramount Pictures, Davis had a decision to make.
And the decision was the right one.
Under his leadership, he streamlined the company to focus on two core businesses: entertainment and publishing. So, throughout the rest of the decade, Gulf and Western sold off many factories, suppliers, and consumer brands. Among those caught in the mix was Sega. Their US manufacturing assets were sold to Bally Midway in 1983. However, Sega's R&D operations, Japanese assets, and IPs were retained. For now. During that time, Sega released its first video game console, the SG-1000, on July 15, 1983 in Japan. The console, which had largely identical specs to the ColecoVision, was released on the same day as Nintendo's Famicom, better known as the Nintendo Entertainment System in North America. Although sales were initially strong, it didn't take long before the Famicom ran circles around the SG-1000. Sega also released a home computer version of the system, the SC-3000, that same year. By the start of 1984, David Rosen had stepped down from his position at Sega. His departure, however, wouldn't last long. On May 21, 1984, with the North American video game crash in full swing, Rosen, along with Hayao Nakayama, with financial backing led by CSK, finalized a deal to buy out what remained of Sega from Gulf and Western and Paramount for $38 million. From that point on, the two companies went their separate ways. Sega would eventually re-enter the US arcade business in 1985, and in the following year released their first video game console in North America, the Master System, originally released in Japan the year prior as the Mark III. However, it couldn't make a dent against Nintendo, which at the time dominated the newly revived video game market in America. Sega would eventually achieve success in the console market with the Genesis, also known as the Mega Drive outside of North America, and Sonic the Hedgehog, creating a bitter rivalry against the Mario juggernaut. However, following a series of disastrous business decisions, such as the 32X and the botched American launch of the Saturn, David Rosen and Hayao Nakayama resigned from the company. 2 years after the launch of the Dreamcast, Sega left the console business altogether in 2001 and became a third-party publisher going forward. Meanwhile, Sega continued to be successful in the arcades. In 2004, Sega merged with the Sammy Corporation, forming Sega Sammy, who would go on to acquire Atlas, the animation studio TMS, and more recently, mobile gaming studio Rovio, the makers of Angry Birds. In a way, we've sort of come full circle. Sega got its start making slot machines in the 1940s, and now they're part of a company that makes slot machines in the present day. As for Gulf+Western, they continued to sell off their non-entertainment assets, and eventually dropped Industries from the company name in 1986. Gulf+Western did resume their buying spree, acquiring book publishers Esquire and Prentice Hall, as well as the theater chain Mann Theaters, after regulations on theater ownership by studios had relaxed. Following plans to sell off the associates to the Ford Motor Company, Gulf+Western officially changed its name to Paramount Communications on June 5, 1989. Paramount would go on to acquire some TV stations, a chain of theme parks, and even returned to making video games for the PC market. On July 7, 1994, Paramount was acquired by Viacom for $10 billion, and the former would formally merge into the latter by January 3, 1995, effectively making Paramount a Viacom company. Viacom quickly sold off Madison Square Garden, vacated the former Gulf+Western building, now occupied by and folded Paramount's video game arm into Viacom's new media division, which in turn merged with another Viacom subsidiary, Virgin Interactive, which itself, along with Westwood, were sold to Electronic Arts. I hope you got that all down. On May 4, 2000, Viacom bought the CBS Corporation, formerly Westinghouse, but then in 2005, Viacom split into two. New Viacom got Paramount Pictures, while the rest of the studio stayed with the original Viacom, renamed to the CBS Corporation. Both companies would remerge in 2019, creating Viacom CBS, later renamed to Paramount Global in 2022, essentially taking us full circle. On October 30th, 2023, Simon & Schuster, the last remaining subsidiary from the Gulf+Western years, was sold to investment firm Kohlberg Kravis Roberts for $1.62 billion, marking the end of an era. In 2024, Paramount became the subject of a bidding war, one of which involved a joint bid from Apollo Global Management and Sony. I don't know, guys. Seeing Sony's name attached to Paramount just doesn't feel right. Ultimately, Skydance Media, run by David Ellison, the son of Oracle co-founder Larry Ellison, won in the end, and announced it would acquire Paramount on July 7, 2024, marking the beginning of a brand new chapter. And so that leaves us with one final question. How did Sega and Paramount reunite after all these years? For that, we have to rewind a bit. On June 10, 2014, Sony Pictures announced it was developing a live-action computer-animated film based on one of Sega's biggest franchises, Sonic the Hedgehog. Development on a Sonic movie had dated back as far as 1993. Initially, Sega struck a deal with MGM and Trilogy Entertainment Group to create a live-action animated film titled Sonic: Wonders of the World, with the screenplay to be written by Richard Jeffries. However, the film was quickly cancelled due to creative differences, and proposals for a Sonic movie would continue to be tossed around, including one that was pitched in 2003 by Ken Penders. But the less said about it, the better. This new film would be produced by Neil Moritz and his production company Original Film, with Marza Animation Planet, the studio behind the animation for the Sonic games, as a partner. In 2016, Blur Studios' Tim Miller and Jeff Fowler joined the project, as executive producer and director respectively. Blur Studio had previously worked on the cutscenes for Shadow the Hedgehog and Sonic 06, and the Sonic movie would mark Jeff Fowler's directorial debut. Pat Casey and Josh Miller were also brought in to pen the script, replacing the original writers Evan Susser and Van Robichaux. The film was set for a theatrical release in 2018. However, in October of 2017, Sony put the film on turnaround, and the rights were subsequently snatched by another studio, that being, you guessed it, Paramount Pictures. After 33 years, the two companies had finally reunited, even if it was just for one movie. The release date was also pushed to November of 2019, and principal photography commenced and wrapped up in 2018. On April 30th, 2019, the first trailer for the Sonic movie was released, and it looked like this.
Meow?
Yeah, that was most people's reaction to that design. 3 days after that travesty, don't worry, Ugly Sonic would eventually get his redemption, Jeff Fowler announced on social media that Sonic would get a redesign after near-unanimous criticism, and the film was later pushed to February 14th, 2020. Because of this, the original release spot for Sonic was taken over by Playing with Fire. Wait, that title sounds familiar. What was in it again?
My little pony.
That's all I need. The second trailer was released on November 12th, 2019 to a much better reception, proving that bullying works. Sonic the Hedgehog was released to theaters on time in the United States to mixed critical reviews. However, it was a box office hit, grossing $320 million worldwide against an $85 million budget, and became the highest-grossing video game movie in North America. The film was popular enough to get a sequel, released on April 8th, 2022, the same day Warner Bros. Discovery was formed. Guess you could say this is an interesting discovery. Yeah! Much like the first film, it too received mixed reviews, albeit more favorable. It was also a box office hit, grossing $405 million worldwide against a $90 million budget. For a while, it held the record for the highest-grossing video game movie in North America, until Illumination's Mario movie thwomped everybody. Nevertheless, the Sonic movie franchise is still going strong. A miniseries starring Knuckles made its way to Paramount Plus on April 26, 2024, and quickly became the streaming service's most-watched original series ever, even contributing to Paramount's first-ever streaming profit. And now we have the third Sonic movie, which came out on December 20th, 2024, the same day as Mufasa, the Lion King. Due to Disney's overseas head start, Mufasa beat Sonic worldwide. However, Sonic 3 did see more success domestically. And it was also a lot of fun, despite having to endure the lack of heat at my screening. Regardless, Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is the franchise's highest-grossing film to date, and with plans for more Sonic movies and shows on the horizon, I don't see the partnership slowing down anytime soon. This is a huge turnaround compared to the 15-year period when the two companies were brought under the same umbrella. They didn't really do much together until the last few years, but it was still an interesting time nonetheless. From an immigrant working in commodities to becoming a leader of a massive diversified empire, Charles Bluhdorn accomplished what many wished they could. However, it wasn't all roses. His company has infamously made headlines for its rapid growth, and have even made its way into pop culture, being satirized in films like Mel Brooks' Silent Movie, where the main villain is a fictional New York conglomerate called Engulf and Devour. But there are some silver linings to this. The decentralized business model is still in practice today, and has become essential to balancing financial success with preserving creative freedom. Obviously, mergers and acquisitions will continue to be around for many years to come, but aside from a few exceptions, the golden age of incredibly diverse conglomerates are long gone, for better or worse. Today, many of the people who built Gulf+Western are no longer with us. Martin Davis, Gulf+Western's final chief executive, died on October 4th, 1999, at the age of 72. David Judelson, Gulf+Western's longest-running president, passed away on September 17th, 2018, at the age of 90. And lastly, John Duncan, the company's founding president, died on January 12th, 2020, at the age of 92. Although Gulf+Western may be gone, they certainly left a big impact in the business landscape. Its legacy deserves to be preserved, and its story shared for the rest of us. And that's all I've got for this forgotten piece of corporate history. Would you like to see more? There's a lot of other bizarre business blendings that I like to cover on this show, so let me know what you'd like to see next. But for now, I've got some unfinished business to take care of. So until then, I'll see you all next time. Take care. Hey folks, if you liked what I have to offer, consider supporting the show on YouTube and Patreon. Otherwise, leave a like and comment if you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you. If it's a Paramount picture, it's the best show in town.
My little
Except for that...